What is going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Masculine Health Solutions Podcast, where we discuss everything related to men's health, physical health, and of course, our development, just as dudes in any regard. And we're willing to talk about the taboo, be it male enhancement, sexual performance, all that good stuff. And I'm your host, CJ Rodriguez, always looking to get people into the best possible shapes of their lives, because that is what I do. I'm a fat loss coach, and if you want to learn more about that, be sure to click one of the links in the description. But let's talk about our wonderful guest today. This was an in-depth conversation, and one that I think needs to be had more and more for a lot of dudes out there who are suffering in silence and unfortunately are reaching for the wrong coping mechanisms. Alcohol, we know that stuff does not work. It's going to basically rot your liver, make you dumber, and does nothing for you. Might I mention it also leads to erectile difficulties in the long run, right? So again, not something you want as a dude. Alcohol, drugs, porn, all that stuff is absolute bullshit and will do absolutely nothing good for you. However, on the flip side, I had a great discussion with Shane Pokroy, right? And he's a psychotherapist, coach, and mindfulness meditation teacher with a rich background in counseling psychology, right? And we got into discussing exactly what men can do, and anybody like your wife, anybody can do this, right? And how to apply mindfulness, meditation, and all these different practices that he's basically accumulated in these different skills over the years. And he's put it together in a way that's very coherent, makes a lot of sense, but it's simple enough that anybody can do. And honestly, we got into the conversation of how to actually sit still with yourself, learning how to sit with yourself and not think, almost like detach yourself from the thoughts that you're having, and how this translates into a better, more fulfilling life. It was a very in-depth conversation, one that I think you guys would truly enjoy, because it's about getting your mind right, which is something that unfortunately we don't do in this fast-paced life. For the most part, a lot of us are just all over the place, trying to, put out a million different fires. And the beauty of Shane Pokroy is that he tells us how to go back, go within, be mindful, learn inner peace. All the stuff that might sound a little bit woo-woo, but the more and more that I learn about it, the more and more I think we need to start applying this ASAP, right? So let's talk a little bit more about Shane and his background. His approach in therapy and coaching is deeply rooted in humanistic and compassion-focused methodologies, emphasizing the power of empathy, understanding, and mindful presence. Shane specializes in providing personalized care that addresses a range of mental health concerns, with a particular focus on men's issues, anxiety, and stress management, because Lord knows we got a lot of that going on in this world. His mindfulness sessions are designed to foster a deep connection between mind and body, aiding clients in cultivating a sense of peace, balance, and self-awareness in their daily lives. Passionate about empowering individuals in their journeys towards healing and self-discovery, Shane's commitment to his clients' well-being is evident in his compassionate approach and dedication to their growth and development. And I mean, the guy's legit, real deal, came through and even did some exercise with myself. And I love to have these conversations because it teaches me about how much I don't know. And that's the beauty of living this life, is that we just get to learn more about what we don't know, and then hopefully apply these different concepts and make our lives better, which is what this podcast is all about. Looking for all the solutions that we can apply. And I really hope you guys enjoy this episode. And last announcement before I take off here is, if you do want to get in shape, you're ready to get rid of that jiggle, get rid of those gelatinous titties, then be sure to click one of the links in the description. They are all there. Or if you want to talk about PE, and then there is an episode that I'm going to have coming out here pretty soon addressing a pretty common inquiry. So, when the time comes, I'll let you guys know all about that good stuff. But again, if you want to reach me, just be sure to click one of the links in the description. I got all the good stuff there. And be sure to follow on Instagram at masculine_health_solutions.pe or at CJRodsFit. But that's it for today. Let's jump on into today's episode with Shane Pokroy. Before we get started, one more thing. If you want to get any PE gear, be sure to check out TotalManShop.com. That is TotalManShop.com. And use the promo code MHS2020. Promo code is MHS2020 and get 12% off. Be sure to check out their wide variety of all kinds of good quality PE equipment. All right, and that's promo code MHS2020 for 12% off. And the website, once again, is totalmanshop.com. What is going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Masculine Health Solutions Podcast, where I am joined by Shane Pokroy, the psychotherapist, coach, meditator, and podcaster. Well, doing more of the guest side of things this year. And we are truly blessed in having him on the show because he's going to tell us a lot of things that I think guys overlook. You know, like when it comes to any aspect of health, for some reason, I think maybe just a guy thing, but we tend to overlook it until it's too late. So let's get ahead of that stuff today. But first and foremost, before we jump in, Shane, how are you, man?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I always love talking about mental health and things that can really help guys improve their lives and figure out ways to just live more fulfilled, right? Live happier, healthier lives. So it's great to be here.
You know, I think it's a blessing when I saw that, you know, I was reading your bio and all that stuff. And, you know, I think it's one of those things that is overlooked far too often, and it shouldn't be, because it almost seems like the older we get, the more we start to realize how important these things are. And for some guys who are maybe also on that, you know, latter part of life, you may not even realize these things. So, you know, I'm hoping that today can shed a lot of light on these subjects. But the other thing I wanted to really ask you, and I ask all my guests, is just like, how did this journey start for you? Like, where did it begin where you're like, hey, you know what? I really want to get into this field?
So as a therapist, it's an interesting story, right? So I would say I have two main fields, right? One field is like psychology and psychotherapy, and the other field is mindfulness and meditation. And I'll give you a little backstory on both. So psychotherapy was really just more of a calling in the sense of like I'd always wanted to work with people. I'd been able to talk to kind of anyone growing up, you know, whether it was my friends or family or whatever. I could really connect with just about anyone, which was really cool. Like it's just a wonderful sort of natural gift, and I wanted to use that to sort of help people in a really meaningful way. And therapy seemed like the best approach for that. I also grew up with two parents who are therapists, and so it was like
Oh,
really
geez.
in the family. Yeah, I mean, if you have questions about that, you're welcome to ask. People generally are like, whoa, that must have been really intense, but actually no, it was really chill. And so it was a world that I grew up in, and then I sort of naturally fell into place with it. And then the mindfulness and meditation journey kind of happened about 10 or 12 years ago, really. And it started with a lot of suffering, right? And looking for ways out of the suffering. And I was called, you could say, I don't know why I say called, but like I was really just like something was guiding me towards this book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle,
Totally, yeah.
right? Huge book, like mega famous and number one bestseller for good reason, I guess. And I read it, and that was really just the start of my journey where all of a sudden everything just sort of clicked. And I was like, wow, like this is some really powerful stuff. And I've been meditating and being mindful, you know, every day since then. And it's just transformed my life completely. Like, you know, obviously there's still suffering and there's still pain in the world and things like that. But the way that I view myself and the way that I view other people has just shifted so profoundly that I recently started this like journey of like now starting to teach, right? So for 10 years or so, I was just practicing. And now I'm like, okay, now it's time to spread this wisdom with people.
Yeah. And I mean, the way I kind of see it, that's the whole purpose of acquiring knowledge in this lifetime. I feel like when you acquire knowledge, the whole purpose of you acquiring said knowledge is obviously to overcome whatever issue it is that you have and then spread it with the world, because it does nobody any good for you to just like hoard knowledge, especially when you've overcome something. I almost feel like, I don't know, maybe God's like, this is the responsibility that you have now with said knowledge, you know, and I
Yeah.
kind of feel like ultimately that's almost what you want to do is like when you learn something, you master something, it's like, okay, I almost feel like it's time for me to teach it now, you know? Like I feel like that's a concept that's inherent to mastery.
For sure. And I mean, you know, we don't tend to look well upon people who will keep it all to themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? The most revered people for good reason are those who achieve mastery in some field and then offer the fruits of their wisdom and their labor to the rest of us who are just looking, right? And
Yeah.
I think that, from my perspective, it's not even that I would consider myself a master by any stretch of the, imagination. It's just more like, hey, like I've learned a bunch of things along the way, and maybe I can show you some of those things, and maybe you can skip some of the obstacles that I faced if you come up against them, or like figure out like, oh, someone else went through it too. Like, that's okay. I'm okay as well. Like, and just keep on their journey.
Yeah. And that's the whole purpose of coaching and guiding and being a mentor for different people. It's just like, I know what that issue is and we can avoid that. That's the whole
Yeah.
purpose of like where you come in, you're just like, guiding people and helping them figure that out prior to them ever, well, not prior, because obviously they're going to come up with these different issues. And that's where you just kind of say, hey, this is what you do in this situation. But one
Mm-hmm.
thing that you had discussed or that I see in the points was embracing mindfulness. What does inner peace really mean for you? Because you mentioned how, it started off with suffering and now you're at a place that's good. But what does that inner peace really mean? And how would you define that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, it means different things to different people, obviously, because they're quite broad terms,
Mhm.
mindfulness and inner peace. But to me, what it means is this just general sense of well-being within myself, that I don't feel like I'm at war with myself, right? I don't feel like I'm stuck in a world and just suffering it out. It's
Yeah.
this overall sense of wellness that comes, that basically just expands from within me to feel super connected to the world and to everything and to myself, and to sort of see myself as one with all things, right?
Mhm.
And it's this really, for me, that's what the sense of inner peace is it's the sense of knowing that it's okay,
Yeah.
almost, right? And it's a feeling that I think so many of us are searching for in so
Yeah.
many different areas, right? Is just, and we try so many different things to find that feeling of okayness, of just being like, oh, I'm actually okay right now, right?
Mhm.
And some might call it a feeling of inner security or safety, right? That's one way of looking at it, where you feel like you don't have to be on guard right now.
Mhm.
You can relax. You can be yourself, and it's fine, and you're accepted by the world. And so for me, I found that through mindfulness. And what exactly I mean by mindfulness is,
Firmtech.com. I know you guys have heard of it because we have had Dr. Elliot Justin on the show before talking about just exactly how this wonderful piece of equipment works. And if you didn't know, well, the Firmtech ring actually tracks your nocturnal erections via the app. You just wear it at night, get the data, wham bam and thank you ma'am. You actually have real legit data showing you how you are in regards to your penile health. And the other thing too, if you just want to get somewhere, you're like, hey, you know what? I want my dick to be a little bit harder, a little bit stronger, and have some more intense orgasms and erections. And I can tell you that firsthand because, well, I got both. And that is the Firmtech Max Performance Ring. This one's cheaper, right? But you can always use both depending on what it is that you are after, right? So be sure to check it out, firmtech.com. Use the link in the description to support the show. And again, be sure to get the most out of your sex life with the hardest cock possible at firmtech.com.
it's this basically a state of being aware of yourself, right? And I think it's a state that everyone experiences in life. They just don't pay much attention to, because fundamentally it's the state of being alert, right? There's lots of different words that people have used for thousands of years to describe it, right? Consciousness, awareness. And the reason why there's so many words to describe it is because it's not really a thing that can be described. It's more something that is pointed to, in the sense of, like there's a Buddhist saying, don't confuse the moon with the finger pointing to the moon, right? So it's like, don't get stuck on the word specifically. Let's focus on what we're actually looking at.
Yeah.
And so instead of sort of giving a conceptual answer to this question, right? Which we can delve into for sure, but it would be much more powerful if you and anyone listening would like to experience it, where
Yeah.
it's basically like, so let's do this, right? The most powerful way to experience it is to experience being alive and alert without thinking. Right. Now, maybe that sounds like a foreign concept to a lot of people. They're like, that's impossible. Like, my mind's crazy. It thinks all the time. It's nonstop. Right. And maybe you only feel that way when you've taken some sort of substance, drinking, smoking, whatever it is. But you kind of have that inclination of like, no, I kind of know it's possible to quieten my mind, but it doesn't seem like it's something that's super easily accessible just at a no, at a whim, at notice, right? But it is actually, and it's something that can be cultivated. And so to do so, how about this, right? Tell me what you're thinking between now and now. Was there anything there?
Now, the word.
Right. Okay. But so exactly. It's good. It's a good answer. So just pay attention to your thoughts as I'm speaking right now. Right. And I'll get you to mention them if there are any in a moment. But so pay special attention to the gaps between the words that I'm speaking. And in those gaps, see if there are any thoughts that are going through your head as you wait for me to say the next word. Right. Now, what I'm going to assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that through a lot of those gaps, you actually weren't thinking.
No, yeah, you're right.
Right. You were alert and you were still, just waiting, basically. But you weren't asleep, right? You weren't anywhere else. And so we can confidently say that you can be alive and alert and awake and not thinking,
Yeah.
right? The mind just doesn't pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So I'll just pause for a second. Tell me what you think about this right now.
I mean, I think you're 100% right. I mean, I have delved into meditation a little bit where it's just kind of calming the mind. The one thing that, I worked on in the past was just view your thoughts almost as if it's a screen and they're not linked to you. And I mean, I think the biggest thing too for myself when I learned these concepts was more than anything, it's kind of not disassociate, but separate yourself from the emotions of the thoughts. And then you can just kind of view the thoughts and then you can just kind of get into that stillness mode. But for myself,
Yeah.
I found that I would use what is it, like guided meditations and stuff. And just I mean, at first, because I'm a hyperactive kind of human being, I like to like run around a lot, and all that. But I think one of the toughest things is just learning to sit there with yourself. Like that is
Yeah.
probably the weirdest. Well, it's not the weirdest, but it was really, really, really tough at first.
And that's such a profound insight, right? Because so many of us spend so much time being afraid of ourselves, right? We're
Yeah.
afraid of sitting
Oof.
with ourselves. And we do whatever we can to avoid that because we have this fear that if I stop for a second, if I stop the going, I'm suddenly going to be overwhelmed with emotion and I won't be able to handle it.
Oof.
Right. And that's a really profound fear that many of us have. Right. And so when you do stop, sometimes there is a bit of a flood. Right.
Yeah.
But then you also learn that actually you can deal with it. Right. And that's what's profound.
I got a question in regards to that now, because the first thing that I mean, first thought that came to my mind was, do you think that's why so many of us cope with, when you're going through very difficult situations, do you think that's why many of us men just kind of decide to work even harder on whatever it is that we're working on? Is it a way that we kind of just basically put these emotions to the side and just have our minds occupied with something else? Would you say they're
Yeah.
correlated?
I'd say there's definitely that comes up for people. I wouldn't say it like it's definitely true every time, but it certainly can be a way that we escape, right? Because it's also a way that we escape ourselves and these emotions, like you say, and it's a way that we escape some responsibilities sometimes that we have that we don't want to face,
Yeah.
right? And it's a healthy, it's a much healthier option than like turning to, you know, the bottle or
Yeah.
something like that, which many people do too. And you know what? They're doing the same thing. They're just choosing a different way of doing it. In fact,
Interesting.
some guys choose the gym as their outlet for it, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's like these things are good, but we mustn't let it be the reason we're running away from something,
Yeah.
right? So, like, of course, you should exercise and of course, you should work and of course, you should do these things, but you should do it where it doesn't feel like you're using it to run away from yourself. And I think
Interesting.
that that's a really hard thing to come to grips with, right? Because sitting with yourself means oftentimes means sitting in pain, right?
Yeah.
And that sucks. Like there's no way
Yeah.
around that. It really does. And we tend to make it worse for ourselves because not only do we sit in pain, but we sit with this massive inner critic in our heads that makes it 1,000 times worse because it just sits there and tortures us,
Yeah.
right? And it just says all of the worst things that we could possibly hear. And the way that our bodies work is that, you know, our bodies emotionally respond to our thoughts as if they're real in
Mm-hmm.
external reality. Right? I'll give you an example of this. If I told you to, you don't have to do this, but it's like, think about a situation that makes you feel really angry. If you think about it hard enough, you'll become angry,
Yeah.
right? You will feel that anger. And you can think about it, and there's a physiological response to it too, right? Think about food long enough, you'll become hungry, right? So like it actually changes your physiology as if it's happening in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the easiest one to do is fear, right?
Yeah.
And so when our inner critic basically bullies us, we feel like we're being bullied, right? And we feel that fear so powerfully. And so not only are we suffering this pain of this wound, whatever this wound is that we feel about ourselves or that someone said to us or something, or a fear of inadequacy, something like that, we
Mm-hmm.
then have this inner critic that's going, oh, yeah, but also you suck. And here are all the reasons why, right? And
Jeez.
so why wouldn't you want to avoid that? Of course you would. It's such a human thing to not want to have to deal with that. But
Yeah.
the problem is not dealing with it is oftentimes worse in the long term than dealing with it.
Yeah, man. I mean, when I hear this, it kind of makes me think about how many men are, unfortunately committing suicide right now at an alarming rate. And I think that a lot of it is due to the fact that they don't really want to sit with themselves or have ever given themselves that space or just aren't aware of the fact that there's other ways to deal with those issues. Because I think too often, like you mentioned the gym, and that was my escape when I was a kid. Like that was the first thing I'm like, I found this. I'm like, this is perfect. I could just beat myself into submitting to my, physical needs or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And I do feel like that's it's a great outlet. But at the same time, as far as mindset and a lot of like, healing and a lot of, like trauma work and all that, that's not really going to take care of a whole lot of things. It's just going to make a bigger armor around like a damaged soul, is the best way to kind of look
Yeah.
at it.
And it's exactly right. It's what you said. I'm going to beat myself into submission,
Yeah.
right? It's like that's what we really think is going to work, right? And it's because we're so desperate, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know of better ways to deal with this. And it's also because there's such a profound feeling of aloneness,
Hmm.
right? And that's what leads to the suicides in part. But you know, for a large number of men out there where they're in such pain that suicide seems like their only option, right? Which is such a terrible state of affairs. Right?
Yeah.
And what a what a sad place that things have to get to feel like that's your only option out.
Yeah.
And it's and I think there's far more people who feel it and who think about it than anyone is aware of. Um, Even if most people don't act on it, I think
Yeah.
there's a really profound number of people who have thought about it,
A hundred
which really
percent.
speaks a lot to like, yeah, to us, you know, our society at the moment.
Which is unfortunate. But again, that's why I love having these conversations, because we shed light on how you can actually go about fixing these things. Which is, I mean, my next question leading up to it is like, okay, we know that's an issue, and
Mm-hmm.
I think the probably the first thing anybody has to do in any situation is just say, hey, it is an issue, right? And I think that now, like when you get to that point and you realize it's there, and somebody comes to you and says, hey, you know what, I have these issues, I want to work on myself. What's kind of the first thing that you go about in like instructing them to do? Is it like meditation, inner work, or you just have them sit? Like what does that kind of look like now? Because
Yeah.
I'm curious, because I imagine it's a process. It's not just like, don't worry, just come in and start meditating, read Eckhart Tolle, you'll be good, man.
Yeah. If only it were that simple, right?
uh,
Um, no, well, firstly, though, I mean, if you are experiencing something like that, you really do need to reach out for help. And it's okay to reach out for help, right? That would be like my fundamental message about this, is that sometimes we need help. And if you're feeling suicidal or that bad, like, get help. And there's lots of help available. Now, what I'm happy to answer your question, but also just know that, like, people shouldn't consider this as like clinical,
yeah, advice,
advice.
yeah.
This is just hypothetical about what happens. But so basically, what's interesting is all therapists practice slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we've all learned the same techniques and the same skills, it reflects through your personality very differently. And so when you go to see one therapist, you'll have quite a different experience than when you go see another one. So
Mm-hmm.
what I'll tell you is how people can experience my therapy room. And people can either resonate with that, and that's great, or they won't. And what the studies have shown is that the most important thing in therapy is the relationship you have with your therapist. That's the number one predictor of change, right? It's not the modality that the therapist uses. It's not the frequency of sessions. It's not a motivation to change. It's none of that. It's the relationship you have with your therapist is the mediator of change in the most successfully. So choose your therapist carefully is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But so when people come to me, right, basically what I do is there's two things, right? You have to assess the severity of the situation, right? So you do that. And assuming they don't need more intensive care than I'm able to offer, which would be like medical care, for example,
Mm-hmm.
psychiatric, um, like hospitalization and things like that. That's for the most extreme case, right? But assuming that that's not the case, um, we basically say, okay, what you're looking at is someone who is saying, I'm in so much pain that I think that the best option for me is to die. That's what I'm feeling right now. So then I say, okay, where's this pain coming from? Right? Let's look at this wound. And that's not a simple question, right? Because it's often a lifetime's worth of experience. Sometimes it's mostly like one experience, but oftentimes it's years in the making,
Yeah.
right? And so it's not a simple question to answer. But so we look at that, and we look at that in an environment, which is the therapeutic environment, which says you're allowed to say and feel anything you want in here, and it's safe, right? No one's going to say anything to anybody. And this is your place to work out your thoughts and feelings and express them in a way which is out loud that perhaps you never have before in
Yeah.
safety, right? Maybe you've tried to tell some people and maybe it didn't go well for you, or maybe it did, but it's slightly a different experience, right? Because often, especially with men, they haven't spoken to anyone about it,
Yeah.
right? Or they've kind of like hinted at it with their buddies, but like no one really wants to like actually go deep in that line of questioning. And fair enough, because what are you supposed to know, right? How are you supposed to know how to handle it? And so they come in, and so first and foremost, it's a space to just be yourself fully and be
Mm-hmm.
accepted fully as you are, right? And then we say, okay, well, how do we, one, look at healing these wounds that you're experiencing in a way that's different from dying, right?
Yeah.
And two, give you hope that there are other options. Well, this is simultaneous, really, but give you hope that there are other alternatives in life that'll help you move forwards, right? And three, because usually there's an underlying depression, we need to address that, right?
Yeah.
Usually it's depression. Sometimes that's combined with like post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes it's like other things like personality disorders and things like that. But even so, depression is really the name for the underlying sense of doom and misery and this collapse response of the nervous system. And so we need to get you out of that state. And so we work on doing that through a variety of things. But, like, for example, the easiest thing that we start people off with is basically just finding some positive emotion in your life, right? Like, that's not going to cure you, but we need you to start to feel something good, especially if all you've been feeling is bad for so long. It's like, what can we do that's not detrimental to your health, that makes you feel some sense of goodness, right? And usually that involves connection with people, right? And not always, because it can be just listening to music, for example. Like, it can be anything simple, but usually the most powerful is connecting with people who you love.
Yeah.
Right? That's what takes away that sense of isolation as well. But so it's a really depends on the person and what they need and where they're lacking, and then we work like basically methodically to sort of heal the wound, open the person up to new experience. So we engage in psychological flexibility, it's called, and so that they can shift how they're thinking about things, lift the depression, seek medical intervention if necessary, whether that's psychiatric, inpatient or outpatient, to assist. Like, there's lots of options for people. I'm not a medical expert, so I don't prescribe or recommend or suggest anything. Sometimes I'm just like, you should see with your doctor just to make sure that everything's good, right? And then we basically take it like one step at a time.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of, and I guess this is kind of the same as for me with, like, personal training and coaching people into getting shape. Every situation is a little bit different, right? You can't really prescribe the same thing for everybody when it comes to getting them into the best mental health possible. It's almost like it's always subjective to who they are, right? And I think when you understand them, I think one of the biggest things that I took away from that is that when you open up your doors to somebody who comes in, they're hurting. I don't know why. The biggest thing that kind of stuck out to me is that you accept them exactly for who they are. Do you feel that a lot of people running around right now, just, and I know, I think acceptance in confident people is almost one of those things that is almost intrinsic. Like I accept myself for who I am, and it's very easy for me to like tell people when I've screwed up or whatever. I'm not really seeking validation extrinsically. Do you find that for a lot of these people, though, they just feel like a sense of loneliness or rejection from something they've created inside of themselves, or is it something that actually exists in the society that they're in?
That's an excellent question, and I think there's probably layers of both, right? Depending on the person, where sometimes, for example, people do get rejected, right, by people in their lives, and that's a horrible feeling. No one likes rejection. Like, you can build a resilience against it, but like in the beginning, right, it's tough, right?
Sucks, yeah.
Now, the real interesting part is when we look at like, okay, but how come some people feel much worse about it than other people?
Yeah.
Right? Like, everyone takes the same hit, but some people brush it off and other people collapse.
Yeah.
Right? And that's like a really interesting phenomenon to look at, where why is that the case? And then you look at like resilience factors. So it's like, well, what do you think about yourself? What do you think about this rejection interaction? Like, do you consider it a reflection of your whole life? Like, are you creating this whole narrative in your head about what this means? Or are you just being like, okay, this person rejected me. That sucks. That's over. Whatever. Right. So the narratives we create for ourselves really enforce how we feel about rejection beyond the point of that rejecting interaction itself. Because rejection in the moment hurts, it sucks.
Yeah.
Now, how you think about it in the hours, days, weeks, months, years later is what's important, right?
Interesting.
Because let's say, the healthiest mental attitude towards it would be to contextualize it as a singular opportunity, a singular moment of rejection that, for all you know, has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the other person, right? And so you let it go, right? It does suck, but you hold yourself with compassion, right? And you say, you know what, that sucks. I'm sorry. However you would like to speak to yourself in this gentle way, reassuring, and then you move on with your life, right?
Interesting. Yeah. I
But
mean,
yeah,
yeah, it makes perfect sense in that sense because we all suffer rejection. I know I have, and maybe it's a good thing now that I back at it in retrospect,
mm-hmm.
And I kind of value the fact that a lot of that rejection, a lot of that suffering kind of helped mold me into who I am. However, at the same time, the one thing that you mentioned there was like how you talk to yourself because of it, where I found that because of the rejection and the other things that I've suffered or felt or experienced in my life, I would talk to myself very harshly. As a result of that, I'm just like, okay, well, you know what, you got to buck up, you got to get stronger, this, that, and the other. And that almost goes back to my frame of mindset that I think a lot of men probably reach for that first
Mm-hmm.
initially, almost before you said something that was very key there that, I, again, you said it there, you talked about compassion to yourself. What does that really look like? And how would you go about creating that new I guess narrative in your mind? Like how do you go about changing that? Because I mean, like I said, for myself, perfect example, like yo, it's kind of let's go when you talk harshly to yourself. How do you go
Yeah.
about creating this more compassionate voice inside of your mind?
Yeah. So there's this whole field of work called compassion focused therapy, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
I integrate into my practice a lot. So I actually deal with this all the time, right? And it's such an interesting thing because, men do speak to themselves horribly. People speak to us. We as
Yeah.
humans tend to speak to ourselves horribly until we learn not to,
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally. And so how we learn to adjust that is we go, okay, well, first let's understand what compassion is, right? And basically there's two wings to compassion. One is loving kindness, which is what everyone typically associates with compassion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gentleness and nurturing, super important. But there's this other element to compassion, which we'll call wise, courageous action, right?
Interesting.
Which is basically doing what's best for you, whether you want to do it or not, right? So it's still an act of compassion to do something that sucks because it's good for you,
Interesting.
but you're not doing it with the attitude of, the punishing attitude. You're doing it with the attitude of like, in the same way, I'll give you a different example. Okay, so if we define compassion as the ability to recognize suffering and the willingness to do something about it, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
one definition for compassion, right? Now, suppose we have firefighters who are running into a burning building to save someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's an act of compassion,
Yeah.
but that's not an act of loving kindness as such, right? That's not gentle, right? That's
No, yeah.
fueled with adrenaline and anxiety and just like, and incidentally, a whole lot of mindfulness, right? Because when
Yeah.
you're in that zone, all you can do is be present in that moment, right? Because when our lives are at stake, we're forced into the present moment, and that's why people like extreme sports and things like that,
Yeah. I was
because
gonna
it
say.
makes us feel alive because we're fully focused in the present, which is like a meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so that's an act of compassion. And so, when you don't feel like going to the gym, but it's good for you, right? You can
Yeah.
either beat yourself into going to the gym, or you can say, you know what? I know it's good for me, and I want to be good to myself today. So I'm going to go to the gym, right?
Interesting.
And it's just these different ways of talking to ourselves. Now, you have to figure out what works for you because everyone's voice sounds different,
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting. Some people talk to themselves in terms of the first person, so they say I. Some people in the second person, they say you. And some people are a mix of both, right? But it's just really cool to think about how some people talk to themselves differently. I've never met anyone who talks to themselves in the third person, right? Like that would be very interesting. But so whether you talk to yourself in the version of I or you, so think about it in terms of how would you treat a loved one that you're
Mm,
responsible for caring about, right? So let's say you have a loved one that you're caring for, and it's your responsibility to make sure they're doing what's good for them. One of those things is going to the gym every day, right? So you can approach this situation in different ways. One is, the sort of more like brute force of like, just get up, get it done, go, 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 be tough. Like that's one approach. Yeah, it works for some people. If that works for you, fine. But what I suggest people do is take note of how you feel when you hear those things, right? Do you feel motivated in a good way, or do you feel like resentfully motivated? Right? Because
yeah.
resentfully motivated is not a fun state to be in. And, from my perspective, it's like, listen, we're on earth to live life, right? And to enjoy the passage of time to the best of our abilities. And so, why put yourself in these resentful moods when there is an alternative that's also motivating to you? And this one would be like, come on, let's go. You can do it, right? The sort of, you might think of an inspirational speaker or a
Yeah.
motivational coach trying to coach you. And like, I mean, just speaking for myself, I would rather have that than the one who's like, you suck, get off your ass and just get there. Like, I don't want that in my life. Right. But that's
Yeah.
how I would talk to myself before I started thinking about it. And that's where mindfulness comes in as well, is you have to be aware of these things that are going on in your mind. Right. Because if you're not aware of them, they're just happening to you.
Yeah.
Right. But once you become aware of them, you can start to rewire your brain basically by saying, that's not how I want to speak to myself.
Wow. It's like you are a victim to yourself. As messed up as
Yes.
that might sound, it's like,
And yeah, you're the perpetrator and the victim.
wow, dude, it's fascinating because I mean, now that I've had it explained from this perspective, it really makes me think about that. And I feel like there are situations where it's almost like you lean into some of darker the darker emotions, but at the same time, it's kind of, I understand that there's a time and place for it, maybe, but I don't really think that, talking down to yourself is really beneficial. The way that I think we've glorified it in our society, I guess sometimes where, we talk too much about, talking down ourselves essentially is I don't know why we glorify that. I don't really think it's
Yeah,
necessary.
I agree. And you're right. It's like we can definitely lean into the darker emotions and have them motivate us. They can be, right? Like you can be insanely motivated by hate,
Yeah.
right? And resentment. Like that's one of the most powerful motivators. The
Mm,
question is, if you're doing it to yourself, is that the way you want to be in the world?
no.
Right? Because it's certainly not the way I want to be. And whenever I'm motivated by negative feelings, I check myself,
Yeah.
right? I'm like, what's actually motivating me here? What thought or belief do I have? And do I actually want to act in accordance with it? Right?
Yeah.
Or am I going to take this as a moment of reflection, do, a quick few conscious breaths to just regulate my nervous system and just move on,
Mhm.
right? In a way that I want to live in this world. And
Yeah.
it's true. Our society glorifies that way of speaking. I don't really know why, to be honest. I just know that that's just not the way that I want to live, and I don't
No,
think that's the way most people want to live.
not at all. And I understand that for some people, maybe it can help to spur them in the right direction. Maybe. But I feel that too often we continue to glorify this and we continue to think like, okay, we just got to feed off the negativity. And I don't think it's like the older I get, the more I just realize it's not healthy because the way I kind of see it. And it's funny that you mentioned, being compassionate to yourself. And I, I think one of the biggest things that ever changed my vantage point was having the fact that I got two boys, right? And the way I
Mm-hmm.
see it, it's like, dude, I would never really talk down to them like that if we were practicing or whatever the case may be. And you know what the funny thing is that back in the day, I would talk more harshly to them. Now I'm like, no, it's more about being constructive. You know, it, I found that you just kind of you're gonna break them essentially, or you're gonna teach them to hate themselves because they're never good enough. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is completely wrong. That approach is dead. That approach is stupid. If anything, it's kind of like you do want to push them to go harder, but it's almost like validate their effort and always find something positive, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
find that that's something that's missing a lot now. Again, when you go back to the coaching side of things, and it's just like, a lot of people swearing. I'm like, I don't like that. When I coach people, I'm like, build them up, man. It's my job to build up their confidence and, just help them know that what they're doing is correct and, just kind of keep building on it. The other thing that you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned too, or the thought I had when you mentioned compassionate to yourself, do you find that that's in any way linked to the inner child or childhood trauma and stuff? That a lot of people just kind of have abandoned that self love and just kind of replaced it with something else? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that there's definitely correlations with our past experiences and the way that we treat ourselves, right? Because I think one of the things that it comes down to at a fundamental level is that, you know, the way we treat ourselves is often an internalization of the way we were treated as children,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's when you learn how to be in the world.
Yeah.
And if your parents are basically always reinforcing a particular message, then you're going to reinforce that message for yourself because you've learned, and you didn't mean to learn this, but this is just how our brains work, is you've learned that this is how you have to be in the world in
Yeah.
order to survive. Because when you're a little kid, even more so the younger you are, but you look to your parents for survival, right? Fully. You're like, they're keeping me alive. So whatever they're doing works.
Yeah.
And whatever I'm doing that's in contradiction to what they're doing must be wrong,
Hmm.
right? Which is really harsh if
Yeah.
what they're doing is actually wrong. Because it makes more sense for the child to say, you know what? It's the same reason why, kids who are abused often blame themselves, right? Because in their minds, it makes more sense for them to be wrong and to take the punishment than it is to consider the possibility that their parent who is responsible for caring and keeping them alive is wrong and doesn't know what they're doing, because that's a real scary possibility, right?
Yeah.
And so the kid blames themselves, and because that's easier. And we do that as adults too all the time, right? We blame ourselves for things that have nothing to do with us. And that's, internalized messaging from childhood, which we all have, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of like, are you able to recognize that within yourself? And because you can change it, right? It doesn't have to be that way, right? That's what healing is about. And that's a large part of therapy sometimes, is to look back and say, like, what were these messages that I got? And how did I learn to deal with that? And so
Yeah.
one of the things, interestingly, on the same point, is that, if the messaging that you got as a kid was that you're not good enough, right? You might, and that the world is very aggressive, let's say, and scary. Well, then
Mm-hmm.
you might sort of have this approach that I need to be scary and aggressive in the world to be good enough,
Hmm.
right? Which is not to be confused with being strong, right?
Yeah.
Because I think you should be strong, right? Strength is a virtue for sure. I'm not saying that you should never, but it's where is it coming from? That's the question,
Yeah.
right? And are you in control of it, or is it controlling you?
Yeah.
Right? That's what I think is really a profound thing to consider is, are you trying to be the strong person because you want to feel good about yourself, because you want to feel powerful and in control? Fine, great, right? No problem with that. Or are you doing it because you feel like you're trying to overcome yourself with
Mm.
strength and overcome your pain? And that's where it's like, well, doesn't really matter how strong you get. You're never going to overcome that because this is emotional pain, right? You need to deal with that.
Yeah.
And largely part of that healing is to be kind to yourself, as hard as it is. And people, it's interesting as well, right? Is people think that if I'm kind to myself, I'll lose all motivation,
Yeah,
right?
no, that's yeah.
They go,
I felt that.
yeah, they're like, if I don't bully myself, then I'm never going to try for anything because I'll just give myself the out all the time. But
Yeah.
we're actually more motivated through, you know, wise action and loving kindness than we are through fear,
Interesting.
right? We just don't think about it like that, right? It's basically saying like we're more motivated by positive rewards than negative in the long
Interesting.
term. Yeah.
Interesting. Because I mean, I've always had that. Well, I mean, when I discovered that belief of like we're usually motivated by either pain or pleasure, I thought about myself, and I mean, I've always been motivated by pain, initial pain, struggle, hurt, whatever. It was again the negative side of things because that's just what my childhood, what I saw around me, the situation I was in. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was like the only way to really motivate yourself. It wasn't so much about the accomplishments, and it was more just I need to do XYZ because this will protect me. This is the armor that I need to get through life. So then, and I have this discussion. Well, I used to have this discussion all the time with like my wife too, and sometimes we just discuss the fact that like if I had never discovered or felt that pain, would I still have gotten into bodybuilding? Would I still have
Mm-hmm.
gotten into like that side of things? Would it really have motivated me into that direction? Or would the trajectory of my life be completely different? Sometimes, as we discuss that, I don't really know because that's those are the cards that I was given, right? But at the same
Yeah.
time, it is food for thought. But the older I get, to your point, in the long term, I don't want to be motivated by constant like running away from something or building up a strong armor just to protect like a fragile soul. Like, you know what I mean? It just seems like
Yeah.
something that just not very good for me, right? It's almost
Mm-hmm.
like staying in that poisonous kind of treacherous situation. But how, like for myself, I found that, yeah, you're right. Like when you find positivity in the stuff that you're doing, accomplishing different things, it almost changes that frame of reference. Now, for somebody that's maybe still in that negative side of things where they feel they have to work 20 hours a day or they got to drink or whatever, like how would you go about reaching out to them in that situation, kind of changing their frame of mind from like, okay, you don't got to deal with the negative side of things so much, look at something that you've accomplished, or how do you go about just making that shift, I guess?
Yeah. That's a great question. And also, just by the way, like to your point, it's like you needed to build up that suit of armor to protect yourself to survive, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to underplay the necessity of that because certainly as kids, right, we have this amazing ability to adapt and survive. Like that's your number one objective. And so you build up this persona and these behaviors and this way of being in the world that keeps you alive,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that means, right? And so it's only once you're in a position where you can actually afford to reflect and say, is this how I really want to be? Because I don't need this
Yeah.
to survive anymore, right? Because if you're growing up in like a really, really rough neighborhood, right, where it's very dangerous, you might have to be very dangerous yourself to survive,
Yeah.
right? That's a reality a lot of people face. And I'm not saying that's not true, but I'm just saying sometimes people have choices and then it's a matter of like, well, what choices do you want to make about your life, right?
Yeah.
How do you want to start seeing things? And then to answer your question, it's like, okay, so what are you doing if you feel like you're in a hole that you can't get out of, right? I mean, the easiest thing to do is to reach out for help, right? Let someone be there with you, right? Now, a friend, a family member, anyone, just say, you know what, I'm really struggling right now. Because no one's going to be like, well, I hope not. No one's going to be like, well, you good, you should be struggling, whatever.
Yeah.
But they're going to be like, it's okay, right? Because that's what human connection does, right? Is it
Yeah.
allows us the space to be and to process. And then if you're looking more seriously at it, right, there's lots of things you can do. If you're going to try and tackle it by yourself, there's all the self-improvement stuff. You just make sure you find stuff that you resonate with that feels like it's leading you down a healthy path, right? It's like, look to the people who espouse values and behaviors that you want and resemble it as such, right? And not trying to sell you something that they don't have themselves, basically, right? And then, so that's if you're wanting to do it by yourself. And then if you're looking to do it with someone, talk to your partner, talk to your friends, whoever's in your life, and say, like, listen, like, there's some things I need to sort out. One of the most powerful things you can do is talking, right? Because what it allows you to do is take your thoughts out of your head and put them into reality. Therapy, a huge part of therapy is basically giving people the space to lay out all of their problems. Because they've never done that before. It's this big mess in your head, right? And then you lay it out all in front of you. And actually, things don't seem as bad as they do when they're all in your head, because you're now looking at what's real, and then you can start to do stuff about it. And so that's really where I would say people can start. And then obviously I'm a coaching and therapy proponent, but it's not always within people's reach. So fair enough. And meditation is huge as well, right? I'd recommend that to everyone. And you know what? Start with like 2 minutes. Like, it doesn't matter. Right. Like, there's that powerful explanation of building habits that starts with like 1% improvement, right? Just do that. Just do one thing for yourself. And so maybe you take, even if it's just one conscious breath, which means just be aware of the sensation of your breathing for one deep breath. And that's the reason why that's powerful, is it's actually physiologically powerful, because a deep breath signals to your nervous system that you're safe, right? Because when you're not safe, you breathe very shallowly. And so a deep breath signals safety. Then the conscious part of it, which is paying attention to the sensations that you're feeling, takes you out of your mind, whatever train of thought you're stuck on, right? So now all of a sudden you're back to the present, and you're like, okay, like, things are okay now, right? And if you can do 2 or 3, even better. Just see, man, like, you don't have to do 20 minutes or whatever, right? And if that's too hard, put on a guided meditation if your mind's too busy. Like, that shit's powerful, right? Use it. And so that's what I would say. That would be my answer to that question.
No, and I think it's a perfect way to wrap it up, because I didn't even realize it, but we're already coming up on the hour, man. It was too fast, because I'm looking at all the notes. I'm like, oh man, but I got a million different questions. So definitely gonna have to talk to you again, Shane, because honestly,
for sure,
I feel like this is a way bigger subject that needs to be explored, first of all, and second of all, it's the minor changes that get things, kind of get the ball rolling. But I definitely feel that, like, oh man, it's just such a deep subject, and I feel like not that we glossed over it today, but there's just so much more that we could go over, man. And like I said, I'm just kind of like, oh man, running out of time. But
it's cool, man. We'll do it again.
No, 100%. And tell us again where we can find you as well. All your links are always going to be in the description, but just let us know right now.
Yeah, for sure. So if people want to find me, my name is Shane Pokroy, ShanePokroy. And you can just Google me, or just shanepokroy.com, and I'm on Instagram. Like, you can find me.
Perfect. I'll be sure to add all those links. Shane, it was an absolute pleasure. And like I said, man, this is deep subject where we got to, dive in even deeper next time. So I look forward to having you on again and really exploring this subject, man. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Hey, you know what? We're going to do this again. And when we do, I'll let everybody know. Until then, see you in the next episode.